You're live.
Thank you, sir. Welcome, everybody, to today's design guideline charrette. Thank you for being here. This project is made possible by the state's MVP Action Grant Program that we are a recipient of. Today, we'll be discussing the development of the resilient guidelines and how best to adapt our historic district in an environmental setting for rising seas. Our consultants are Lisa Craig from the Craig Group, who facilitated our first community forums back in September, and Phil Thomason of Thomason Associates, who will facilitate today's charrette. They'll lay out the purpose and provide info on flood adaptation and discuss the National Park Service guidance on flood adaptation and treatments. And thank you for today's participation. We greatly appreciate it.
Well, good morning. Again, I'm Phil Thomason. I'm principal of Thomason Associates in Nashville. And really over the last 10 years or so, been working with communities along the coast and other areas dealing with flooding issues, how to recover after disasters. And so we've been, again, working with Lisa on this project here since the first of the year. But just to go ahead and talk about what this workshop is about. So our format is, we have 3 presentations today, and thanks for bearing with us for the next few hours. And again, we're doing this as best we can with the Zoom format. Ideally, be there to do this presentation, but we're all having to make all these adaptations due to the pandemic. But first, we're going to go through sort of the historic buildings and resilience resources and previous studies. Sort of how did we get here, and what have we learned over the last 20 years or so with how to adapt our historic buildings in the face of rising sea levels and flooding. So we're going to have that discussion here for a while. And again, I want this to be interactive. Please use the chat room. If you have something that you would really like to express and say, then Holly will be taking a look at those reactions and just have some sort of dialogue back and forth. At the end of that, the first presentation, we'll take a 10-minute break. And then we'll be back for the second presentation, which is the National Park Service guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. These are guidelines that came out in November of last year. So they're relatively new. The National Park Service is working on another set of guidelines that are more illustrative in nature. So we are looking for those to come out at some point in the next year or so. At the end of that discussion, we'll take another 10-minute break. And then at the end, we're going to have another session where we do case studies and exercises. These are going to be strategies for flood adaptation. And what I'm looking for there is, okay, we have a number of buildings that have been elevated, or a number of buildings that we need to look at strategies for how do we work with these buildings in the most positive way to preserve their historic character and integrity in the face of flood issues. So we'll want a lot of interaction, especially during that session. So that's the format that we have for today. And again, appreciate your participation and look forward to some dialogue here. So again, the purpose of this project that we've been working on is to serve as an addendum to Building with Nantucket in Mind, to supplement design review by the Nantucket Historic District Commission, and inform preservation planning for the Nantucket Historical Commission and public. We will be addressing current approaches to design review and elevating and hardening historic properties. We will be examining the potential for new construction within historic districts, establishing parameters for elevated new construction that fits into the historic residential and commercial areas as best as possible. So at the end, what we want to provide is a user-friendly set of design guidelines which incorporate photographs and drawings specific to Nantucket's historic properties. And graphics we'll use to illustrate common architectural styles, building details, and recommended elevation techniques. I will be coming to Nantucket, unless there's some sort of different change with quarantining, on Tuesday of this next week, and I'll be there until Sunday of next week as well.
Oops, sorry. There you go.
So this is our timeline. Just to give you an idea of how the project has proceeded, we began work in February, March and September. Again, we had to sort of work around the difficulties of getting to the island because of the pandemic. But we're able to do some research and survey resources and streetscapes in the study area of the historic districts. And then today, again, we have the online community design charrette or workshop, and another one will be next week, next Saturday. And that's after I've had some time to really be in the cities, in the towns, and get some photographs and do some on-site examination and field survey. So that's what I'm looking at, having a much more site-specific discussion next Saturday. In December, we will develop and submit the outline for the design guidelines. And in February, we will move forward with preparing a draft for review and get comments back. And then finally, we hope to have the final version and presentation in April 22nd, 23rd next year at the Resilient Nantucket Public Forum. So that's our timeline. So the design guideline resources that we're using and what we will be basing these guidelines on are on national standards and guidelines. And I mentioned the National Park Service guidelines. We're also reviewing the Preservation Institute of Nantucket projects that they've been working on over the last 5 to 10 years. Again, the field analysis, as I mentioned, of existing conditions and examples of floodproofing and elevation. Consultation with the staff, Nantucket Historical Commission and Historic District Commission about issues and our recommendations. And again, we review best practices that other states and local communities have done as well with their guidelines. So we'll be taking a look at all of that. So I think the real, there were some FEMA guidelines and some analysis done back in the 1990s, but this wave of interest in all of this analysis of design guidelines and how they affect historic buildings with sea level issues and flooding really got spurred, of course, by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. New Orleans, the Garden District and the French Quarter, those areas didn't flood very badly, but many of the other historic neighborhoods all throughout the city did. And it was really devastating to those communities, the Ninth Ward, other historic locations throughout the city. Preservation professionals were brought in from all around the country to help FEMA go through a very difficult and arduous process of deciding, which buildings could be salvaged and which could not. And those that were raised, okay, if they're gone, what goes back in their place? How do you look at flood proofing then, knowing that New Orleans is prone to flooding, and what are the consequences and how do we move forward? And it was not just New Orleans. It was all along the Gulf Coast. You had communities like Pass Christian, you had Biloxi, Mississippi, just a number of communities that were really devastated by Katrina. And we lost so many properties. As a matter of fact, I did design guidelines for the Beach Avenue Historic District in Biloxi back in the 1990s, and we lost a good percentage of those houses along the beachfront to Katrina. And it's not just along the coast. The Cedar Rapids flood that we had in 2008 was another devastating situation. You can see the historic church there in the middle of the water right there to the east, the right of the bridge. But that flood was also just a major issue throughout the Midwest. And again, a number of preservation professionals were called in to do some work in that area. I went to Benton, Iowa to work on a FEMA project. So we're all just sort of dealing with these issues one after the other. And of course, then we had along the Atlantic coast, Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which just devastated a number of the beachfront communities. Many historic buildings along the coastline suffered greatly. And this is next slide, please. And so we had issues where this is a two-story brick house and it's just almost gone, and then other historic properties that were along the beachfront. So we end up now looking at where Nantucket is and sea level rise. So sea level rise estimates for the Massachusetts coastline projects possible sea level rise in the Commonwealth of up to 3.3 feet or 1 meter higher than global averages. Sea level rise data collected in Nantucket Harbor indicate that Nantucket's average sea level has been increasing by about 0.14 inches per year since 1965, rising to around 7.7 inches higher by 2020. In the Town of Nantucket Coastal Risk Assessment and Resiliency Strategy Study sums up the sea level rise threats Nantucket faces over the coming decades, as based on the 2017 NOAA projections and 2018 Massachusetts projections. It is reasonable to expect relative sea level on the Nantucket coast to rise by at least 4 to 6 feet above 2000 levels by 2100. So that's what we may be looking at. And so as we look at flood insurance rate maps, the federal flood insurance program, they come in and look at the rising levels and come up with what we call the base flood elevation. And this is kind of based on our insurance rates, and the base flood elevation is the elevation of flooding, including wave height, having a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year, also known as the base flood and 100-year flood. And the BFE is the basis of insurance and floodplain management requirements, and is shown on, again, the flood insurance rate maps, which we call FERMs. So the BFE in the Nantucket Historic District varies from 7 to 9 feet, and the Secaucet Historic District varies from 9 to 10 feet. In addition to the BFE, both of these historic districts also have what we call a design flood elevation, the DFE, and regulatory flood protection elevation, which is 1 foot above the DFE. So the design flood elevation is a regulatory flood elevation adopted to add additional height as a factor of safety. This additional amount of height is also called the freeboard, which is the level at which a structure's lowest floor must be elevated or flood-proof to be in accordance with the town's floodplain management regulations. And this is just an example of a simple little diagram just showing, again, what the base flood elevation is, which is just the line that's right there above the water. And then what the design flood elevation might be for a given community. And the difference in between is called the freeboard there. So again, you look at the top of the lowest floor as the DFE. So we look at, again, what's been done to this point and what have we learned from this point in terms of what the resources are out there. So some FEMA resources go back to the 1990s. The one on the left is wet flood proofing requirements for structures located in special flood hazard zones in accordance with the National Flood Insurance Program that came out in the 1990s. But the real wave of new FEMA information, FEMA publications to really provide help really came after Katrina in 2005. So you have the flood damage resistant materials requirements that came out in 2008, the flood proofing non-residential buildings that came out in 2013. And I'm showing you all these different publications because they really are pretty relevant, again, to Nantucket and the historic districts, and certainly encourage you to download these. They're readily available on FEMA's website. So these are all resources that you can take advantage of and learn more about. So some of these that came out in the 1990s and on into the early 2000s, we have recommendations for flood proofing, such as application of water resistant paints and membranes, for example, where you have the, you're trying to keep the water out, as you see there on the left with these sort of waterproof paints. And then on the right, where you've got these membranes that are applied to the inner wall of the basement. Now, we're still sort of wondering about, in some cases, these kind of techniques and approaches may not be appropriate for historic buildings, in that they would not allow let's say you have a brick foundation, and they might do more harm than good in capturing the moisture and the water on the interior and not allowing it to seep out or breathe out. So you have to be very careful with these kind of techniques and these kind of applications. Other techniques that are very useful and have been used are water-resistant doors to protect mechanical units. And this is, very, just as you see, where you create a space in your basement that, and this is, you particularly find this in commercial buildings or public buildings, where there is a space that's enclosed with concrete or some other water resistant material, and then you have doors that again can be closed when you have flooding or any kind of high water. And then you have flood shields, and this is we've seen a real rise in the use of these kind of shield panels because they're relatively inexpensive. And this is really for kind of the let's say the flooding that just high water that may be a few feet, that sort of thing. And you might have your building that's up enough in height or with pretty water resistant materials, but you need to protect your door openings or your storefront openings. So these kind of shields can be added and inserted. You can add these temporary kind of tracks, just bolt them to the entrance, and these again can be removed and stored when when they're not needed anymore. And this is where you also have these flood shields combined with these skirt walls, and that the impermeable skirt walls would be of concrete, like you see here. Brick is also another technique to use as a skirt wall, especially on historic buildings that may be of a brick construction. And again, the flood shields are used just to insert within these kind of openings. So those are some of the techniques there that some of the FEMA resources mentioned. And then we have certainly more serious and more expensive adaptation techniques, such as the construction of flood walls. And, I guess one question would be, has there been discussion of these kind of flood walls or any kind of barriers like this, for the town, or what might, is this a possibility? Is this anything that has been considered, or just not really considered to be appropriate or useful for the town? So if there's anyone who wants to speak to that, or any comments, again, would like for this to be, any feedback on this would be helpful. And if not, we can move on. Okay. There's the erection of temporary flood barriers, like you see here. And these are where these can be placed outside, and they're filled with water and provide a barrier that you have then for any kind of flooding that could affect a historic building. And again, the same kind of question: has anyone utilized these kind of barriers that you're aware of on the island? And if so, were they successful? Do they have applicability within the historic districts and the historic buildings in the communities? So that's another question. And any comments about that? If these kind of barriers would at all be, again, as Holly says, feel free to ask any questions. So, would this be an approach that would be workable and be a way of flood-proofing some areas, either individual properties, or could you use this for several houses or several buildings at one time?
Bill, we do have a hand up.
Okay.
From an HDC member.
Let me see. I can see who that is if Holly's already.
It's not letting me.
Oh, yeah, Holly, I can't see all participants, so you'll have to.
Oh, hi, it's,
There you go. Abigail.
oh, hi, how are you?
Great.
Good
Thanks for
morning.
joining us.
Thank you. So Holly, who lives here too, and I'm not sure who else is on that lives here, but we have these ongoing battles between, what's going on in Sconset with the nourishing plant, the sand things, and there's sort of a battle between the townspeople and the Sconset people, and then there's armoring on the North Shore that when you come into the harbor, some people have nourished the dunes, and some people have put hardscaping, like big rocks, but there's no conclusive large-scale design of how to, sort of save the island from these storms. We're not unified in our efforts, and I find that we don't have the sympathy with Sconset that we do on the North Shore, and we're not doing anything at all. So I feel that is hurting us. I was just wondering how to unify the town and getting on board to start doing something universal for the island.
I think I might just step in and give you my perspective, having served in the Historic Preservation Office in the city of Annapolis, working with our planning and public works, city administration, and 30 other stakeholders, businesses, and the like. And what I have to say right now is it may not be as public facing as all of us, you know, that love Nantucket would like to see. But I have to say the town is aggressively moving forward with different planning efforts. Hence why, Abigail, you're seeing us here today. And this has been my second trip, so to speak, to Nantucket. It is not an easy solution, and it is not an inexpensive approach. So as we move forward with better understanding the issues, and Vince can speak well to the island-wide coastal resilience plan that Nantucket is also entering into. What I found in my experience in Annapolis is it is a combination of public and private efforts. The solutions that we're going to be going through that are design solutions, whether temporary or permanent, is part of a larger adaptation approach. And they do have to work in combination with each other. I think my best example was in working in Annapolis. We have the US Naval Academy right next to us. And we served on each other's sea level rise and climate change committees to come up with solutions to protect our National Historic Landmark assets, but doing it in a combined way so that it would not cause more damage to the adjacent properties. Mm-hmm. So it is not an easy process, and the town is currently focusing on that for an island-wide solution. And I think what Phil is trying to get to here is, have we seen, even in temporary measures, the application of some of these flood barriers, these protection methods, and how did they work, whether for individual properties or for a neighborhood or a downtown? And so I think, to your point, the town is moving in that direction, but we still, as individuals and as property owners, have responsibility to try and deal with our own homes and neighborhoods. And so the first step for us in Resilient Nantucket is to provide some means and methods for doing that. I don't know if that gave you a satisfactory answer, Abigail, but that's my larger perspective.
Am I still on talking?
Yes, you are, ma'am.
Okay, so I know on Dionis Beach, there's a very hardscaping below one sort of historic house from probably the 30s or 40s. It sticks out, and they have these huge boulders in front of the house, but I can't think of any. There might be a couple of other places on the island, and I think there is it called scoring or scratching or something that happens on the sides, where it's in a situation where it could easily open up a pond to the ocean. So I'm worried that hardscaping will affect the sides of the armoring and cause. Yeah. So that's why, I'm hoping that the town has a universal approach to the whole island, and not just sconce it doing those sandbags. I mean, maybe the whole South Shore has to be sandbag, or maybe on the North Shore we need more of that hard armoring.
If I might, if that's okay, yes. Jump in here if nobody minds. I'm Vince Murphy. I'm the Coastal Resilience Coordinator. I don't want to step on Phil's presentation or what Lisa has already said, because they've already covered the basics. But effectively, the town is about 7 to 8 weeks into a 1-year process of developing a coastal resilience plan. We've just taken on some consultants, the primary group being Arcadis, and they are going to develop a coastal resilience plan for the island. It's going to be all island and all county, taking in Tuckernuck and Muskeget as well. So no place within the county is going to be ignored. So we are aggressively taking this on, and we're looking into it. The sad reality is this is the beginning of it. The Resilient Nantucket project that this MVP group is about now today is also another part of it. We're looking at the historic side of it. So I don't want to step across and put too much information out on what is an MVP orientated day, but the town is taking it very seriously, and I hope everyone has at least heard or is aware that CRAC and I are driving forward the Coastal Resilience Plan with Arcadis, and that is due for delivery in September 2021. So please stay tuned and please ask lots of questions, and there's going to be lots of public participation in that too.
Well, that's very encouraging, and I suggest maybe, is there an article you could put in the Inky Mirror to make people aware that we are working on, you know, the erosion problem, and yeah, especially downtown. That's probably one of the worst things that's going to be hit.
Yes, that is a plan in the works to put out the public part of that press release. But just so that everyone understands, it's a coastal resilience plan is flooding and erosion and island wide. Anywhere that experiences coastal flooding and erosion is going to be covered.
Yeah.
That's very encouraging.
Yeah, and this plan is to work in concert with this MVP project as well. They were designed to work hand in hand.
Wonderful.
Yes. Thank you, Vince. Thanks for that. And that's exactly the point to be made. This Resilient Nantucket will move into the Coastal Resilience Plan. So anything you come up with, these comments you're making today are critical because that information will feed into the CRP process as well. So thank you, Abigail, very much for that. Phil, did you want to move forward?
Yes, thanks, Vince. Thanks, Lisa. And yeah, we'll just next slide. Thanks. So one of the publications, again, is about flood-resistant materials. And so I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can just see sort of how FEMA looks at which materials are going to be workable and really provides enough flood resistance to be accepted in any sort of rehabilitation of flood damaged buildings. So you've got obviously brick and concrete being flood resistant, you know, gypsum board products, not so much, and you know, plywood, particle board, all those sort of things is what you can use and what you can't use when you do a rehabilitation of a damaged historic building. So that information is out there again in that publication. Okay, a couple of other publications, one from 2017 and one from 2020, protecting building utility systems from flood damage. And that's how to do your best to elevate or get your utilities out of harm's way. And then requirements for flood openings and foundation walls and walls of enclosures. All of this is just sort of refinement as we see going through trial and error in a lot of cases with what works and what doesn't in terms of you know, water flow and flood proofing. So here's an example of FEMA flood opening requirements for buildings and garages. And you can see the flood vents there down at the foundation of the brick section. And then you also see the flood vents in the garage door. So that's one of the requirements then of flood proofing here when you do a rehabilitation project or build something new after you've got perhaps a building that's not restorable and it's raised. But again, this provides you with that information about what size flood vents you need to have, what kind of design they need to be, and again, there's a certain calculation of water per square foot and the number of flood vents that you will need to have. And then recommendations for utility protection. In a lot of cases, you will see where your HVAC units, your condensers are mounted on platforms, like you see here on the left and on the right, and then of course, strapped down so that they don't move or blow away or whatever during any kind of storm. So this is another one of those approaches that FEMA has in their guidelines now. And then we also have that's come out in the last few years, utilizing nature-based solutions to enhance flood resilience and recovery, building community resilience with nature-based solutions. And these are looking at what I think are some of the discussion we just had about using the natural resources, new plantings, retention ponds, that sort of thing, to help mitigate flooding in a community or particular location. So you've got, for example, FEMA recommendations for water retention, like you see here, where you're trying to remove some of the hardscape as much as you can and allow for water to flow into these areas and then drain quickly. Stormwater issues in a lot of our communities are just huge. They're very expensive projects to redo, to enhance stormwater runoff. So these more passive kind of techniques can be very useful in a lot of communities. And then again, an emphasis now on how do you mitigate flooding with historic properties. So coming out in 2005, just in time for Katrina, was integrating historic property and cultural resource considerations into hazard mitigation planning. And then what came after Katrina, the National Flood Insurance Program, Floodplain Management Bulletin for Historic Structures. And I certainly encourage you to download these two publications that FEMA put out. And in a number of cases, we start getting into this whole question of elevation, of elevating our historic buildings, like you see here, where we basically pull the historic building off of its foundation. We use jacking and cribbing to raise it up in the air to the design flood elevation, the DFE, and put it on an entirely new foundation. And we have communities all along the Gulf Coast that began doing these kind of projects in the years after Katrina. And again, I think with some trial and error and some mixed results in a lot of cases. What is going to be the best way, best techniques to retain as much of the historic integrity of these properties, even though we are creating really an entirely new historic context if we have blocks of buildings that are all raised to the same kind of level. I mean, is this still a national, if you do this in a large enough area in your National Register Historic District, are these buildings still contributing to the character of that historic district? Does the district retain its significance from its period of significance? Or do we have to just say that we have to have another period of significance in order for these buildings just to survive? So it's really a challenge. So we end up with a situation like this. This is in New Orleans, where here you see this like a 1920s bungalow at grade, and then you see the cribbing and the jacking of the building up. And then this is the final product once it's raised, and they've incorporated garages underneath, because this is space again below the design flood elevation. That first floor space, or that basement, I guess you'd call it at this point, has to not have habitable space. In other words, you can use it for storage, you can use it for parking, but you can't have any actual living space in this area. So what do you think? Is this successful or not successful? I mean, would you still consider this building to be a contributing property within the historic district? So that's the before, and this is the after. Anybody want to speak to this? Okay. Well, this is one of those early elevations that we would look back and say it's not successful because of the way the staircase was handled, because of the way you have the garages on the side of the house instead of at the rear. And so there's other factors involved with this kind of elevation that looking back, we would say it's not particularly successful. And so it's when these are starting to happen, and here's another example here in this community. This is probably about a 1915, 1920 gable front house, and you can see how it was elevated. And you have the staircase on the side of the house, and it's not a direct association of the front door to the street with a set of stairs. It's on the side. You have front-loaded parking underneath the house, and you have the porch columns that are not in sync with the foundation piers underneath. So we look at this example and see that this is really not successful either. And so there are a number of communities along the Gulf Coast, and the most, I think, well-known of the communities that have taken this approach of elevation is Mandeville, Louisiana. Mandeville is on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, and when Katrina came through, they had an enormous storm surge that just flooded about everything in the first 3 blocks of their historic district. So in working with the flood insurance program and FEMA, they really decided they needed to go up all of those 3 blocks about 7 to 9 feet. So you end up with a house like this, built again probably about 1900, and you see where it's on these new concrete and frame piers, the staircase with a slight landing going up to the front door. But again, does this work? Is this considered to be an appropriate elevation? Again, any comments that you all might have about this, but this is sort of what Mandeville has done with their design guidelines for their historic district, is to work through what they really feel are going to be best practices. And we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail here. But again, this is where the property owners are faced with either paying enormous sums for their flood insurance in the years to come, and face the prospect of, again, being flooded at their location, versus reducing their flood insurance premiums and elevating to the height that is required. So this is just a real dilemma for a lot of our coastal communities about how do we preserve and maintain the integrity of our historic districts, but at the same time meet these requirements. And these are just some other examples that I think are kind of looked at as the initial wave of elevation projects in Mandeville, and which ones are successful and which ones are not successful. So we look at guidelines here where you've got, this is a very historic house. It goes back to the early 1800s. It's one of the oldest in the town. And, you see what they did with the very elaborate staircase, and then you've got these concrete tapered kind of Tuscan column piers that the house is resting on. And, is this, what do we do here? This is the approach that the Historic Preservation Commission in Mandeville approved. And, this is, again, we're just creating a new historic context for this district that is the reality that is faced with this level of flooding and storm surges in this community. So, because of You know, we've got all these different FEMA resources, and we've had the concentration on historic resources. The National Park Service has increasingly stepped in with updating their information and creating a new set of design guidelines for flood adaptation. Now, this is the newest Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. This came out in 2017. And this is an update to earlier Secretary of the Interior standards publications that the NPS has put out. And so within this, you have finally addressing the issue of resilience to natural hazards. And so here you see a discussion of this in the 2017 NPS guidelines. This is a view of the Mies van der Rohe Farnsworth House in Illinois, which is close to the Fox River and has a tendency to get flooded every once in a while, but they've been able to keep the flooding, I think, out of the house so far. But this is just kind of again, their recognition that they really needed to address resilience standards in a much more serious way. And so within the standards publication of 2017, they do start looking at these issues of elevation and hardening. And these are a couple of properties, again, in New Orleans, where, you know, the discussion is, I mean, is something like this adequate, where you use concrete block, the split-faced concrete block, the house on the right elevated to a certain level and the house on the left to a higher level. And you know, at what point do you really start losing some integrity and, you know, really start thinking about what are the best practices for this kind of approach?
Bill, I might add here, having talked to Park Service staff about this particular project, they found the house on the right to be more consistent than the house on the left because of the entrance and expression to a front door. As you can see right here on the far left, they've only had one massive staircase going up to one door. So even within this same area, two different houses, the treatment to the right was seen as more consistent with the standards than the treatment to the left.
Correct, right. Mm-hmm. Yes. And then you also have more emphasis on streetscapes and original materials. Here you have a cobblestone street, you know, the brick sidewalks. The relationship of these historic materials to not only the dwellings, but just the streetscapes and how they really emphasize the historic evolution of the community and the importance of keeping these kind of materials. So that's also something that these guidelines have addressed. And then we look at, again, some other National Park Service resources, the Coastal Adaptation Strategies Handbook that came out in 2016, and then the guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings that came out a year ago. And so the next session, again, when we conclude this first presentation, that's where we're really going to sort of drill down into these NPS guidelines that were published in 2019. But the Coastal Adaptation Strategies Handbook really looked at, in many ways, the threats to the National Park Service resources. So you have situations here along the coast with the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse here on the left, which was famously moved back from the coast a number of decades ago and brought to a place where they think the flooding will be minimal, and that was an eroding shoreline situation, and they were just going to lose the lighthouse if they didn't move it. And then on the right is Fort Jefferson. It's down off the coast of Florida. And they have many issues there with the flooding situations and the deterioration of the brickwork like you see there on the right. So the Coastal Adaptation Strategies Handbook really dealt a lot with their own resources. And then since Katrina, again, we had a number of states that put together their own adaptation guidelines. And I would encourage you to download these as well. The one on the left is from Florida, Disaster Mitigation for Historic Structures, Protection Strategies. And the one on the right is Elevation Design Guidelines for Louisiana and the buildings along the coast. You also have elevation design guidelines that were put together for the state of Mississippi. Again, all of this for Mississippi and Louisiana, a reaction to the impact of Hurricane Katrina. And then New Jersey's elevation design guidelines for historic properties, which came out again in response to Hurricane Sandy. And these are also great resources to have. And then you've got some citywide, some community flood mitigation design guidelines here, like you see for the Stockade Historic District in Schenectady, New York, an area that had repeated flooding, and looking at a overall approach to a historic neighborhood that has repeated flooding issues, and how do we mitigate those. And then that came out just this year, Buoyant City for Miami Beach. Miami and Miami Beach just continue to have serious flooding issues. Just this past week with the hurricane that came through, there's a lot of flooding in downtown Miami. And so the Buoyant City looks at all the different alternatives that they may be facing to adapt to their flooding issues. Boston, their publication, Resilient Historic Buildings Design Guide, that's available now, can be downloaded. And that looks at their neighborhoods that are close to the water, their financial district that is on fill from the harbor and is especially prone to flooding. And then the city of Charleston, their Board of Architectural Review, they started hearing from their constituents for a number of years about the issue of elevation. The Board of Architectural Review was very reluctant to allow any sort of elevation projects. They felt that that may just result in too much of a change to the historic streetscapes. But enough property owners just said, look, we can't afford our flood premiums, and we need to have some sort of guidance here. So they worked for several years recently with a series of workshops and bringing in people from around the community to look at best practices in the city of Charleston. So they now have their own design guidelines for elevation. And then there's other, historic district guidelines that I've worked on and other consultants have worked on. This is the one for Mandeville on the left, and then Beaufort, North Carolina on the right. So this is the kind of approach, and again, the kind of manual that I'm working on for Nantucket. And so this is sort of where we're geared towards and moving towards. And then we also look at, of course, Nantucket-Specific Resources as we put together these guidelines. And again, we've got the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan for 2019. Look at the results of the Community Resilience Building Workshop from April of last year. And then the Coastal Risk Assessment and Resiliency Strategies from early this year. So we take a look at all of these kind of publications and information, because again, we're looking. This is some photos of the high water that happened back in September. We just continue to look at this recurring flooding, and we're also reviewing previous PEN projects that they've been working on. This is the view of the South Washington Street study area that PEN has been looking at in terms of flooding issues and mitigation in this particular area. The South Washington Street and NISDA Harbor Cottages, the resilience and adaptation strategies. And won't read all of this, but you can see the many of the recommendations there on the right about mitigation for flood issues in this area and with those properties. Looking at what's been elevated in Nantucket, and have these been successful projects? How do people feel about this? Is this really best practices? Any design changes that once we take a look at these buildings would be recommended? So again, this is at 57 South Washington Street, and looking at this elevation and how successful this project was. Lower Main Street, the various studies that have been done over the years, and the Penn study looking at the rising sea levels and what buildings would be impacted, what's the height of the flood levels in these streets for these buildings, and just sort of laying out what the challenges are for trying to flood proof or mitigate these buildings for the future. And specific building studies like the Pacific Club and Lower Main Street. So all of these are the kind of resources that we've been looking at and are going to go into what we are going, the development of the design guidelines. And so again, what this would be our detailed field analysis of existing conditions and examples of flood proofing and elevation in consultation with the Nantucket Historical Commission and Historic District Commission, review and analysis of approved resilience projects, and review of best practices in federal, state, and local guidelines. So at this point, would be happy to have any sort of discussion about these resources, what we've looked at, what's available out there for residents in historic districts that do have issues with sea level rise and flooding, and where we are in this evolving process, really. So if y'all have any comments or any particular points you'd like to bring up, be happy to entertain those.
We actually have a couple of questions. Looks like we've got 3 or so. I know. I don't know if Tobias still had his hand up before. I don't know if he wants to speak, but I have Abby, Caroline, and Sarah. Let me go to Sarah first. You should be able to speak.
Hi, Sarah McLean. I have a historic home that's just out of the floodplain, but is in a very wet area. And I'm in the midst of restoring it right now. And we are working with the engineer. It is not a good candidate for raising the structure because it has its original chimney mass and we would lose the 6 flues that are there. So I've chosen to keep that. And then, have piers and sort of effectively try and keep the water out as best I can. But I'm doing that right now. And so I feel as though I'm missing the boat a bit in terms of the best practices going forward, because I need the information literally in the next 3 weeks versus waiting, a year from now. So is there something in the interim? The house shouldn't be raised. It's in the middle of 2 houses that are only 1.5 stories, and this is a traditional Nantucket style 2.5 story house. So in raising the full structure, it would look, I think, ridiculous on a tiny little lane. But I don't know. I mean, short of keeping openings there for water to flow through and raising the mechanicals, which we've, already considered, is there anything else, or is that something that's going to be addressed, further on in the program? Thank you.
Well, the answer is yes. We will have, that's in the next set of design guidelines, but it sounds like you're looking at, the most thoughtful way that you can about trying to preserve and maintain the historic character and look at what your options are with the various flood proofing techniques. And So the next presentation will get into that much more detailed, and we'd like to hear your thoughts as we go through the various wet and dry floodproofing techniques that we have out there.
Phil, I'd also add for Sarah's benefit, there is this concept that came out in the last PIN discussion, but I know Boston is very much on board with this concept of living with water and the concept of using the surrounding environment as a way perhaps to suck up water. In St. Augustine, we were working with a property owner that has a coquina house. And if you're familiar at all with that type of material, it really cannot be elevated. It would fall apart. So the idea was to take the surrounding landscape and make it more absorbent, make it more, particularly for their inundation on a regular basis, but their sunny day flooding that they often get. So I might suggest, Sarah, you work and discuss with perhaps a landscape architect as well. Is there anything you can do on this site to increase the pervious nature of it and really capture the water and flow it away from the property? So site issues, and Phil will talk about that in the National Park Service guidance, taking a look at your site as well as the sensitive choices you've chosen for adaptation to your structure. Holly, did you have
Right,
another?
looks like, yes, we do. We have another one from Caroline Ellis. I'm unmuting you.
Hi, Holly.
You're on.
Yeah, I was interested in at what point do you tell people with proposals, such as one that we have in downtown next to the Pacific Club? The owner clearly is going to spend millions in one way or another, whatever the design turns out to be. At what point do you tell them to wait on the project or to include mitigation? That isn't clear to me how the process works. I understand for buildings that are in place, but for projects, I wonder how that would be addressed.
Holly, I'm not going to speak to the town of Nantucket, and I just have to say, in some respects, I'm also very conscious, having both staffed and served on a preservation commission, that it's not always a good idea to opine on a project that's going to come in front of the commission. I'm instead going to tell you what we did in Annapolis in a similar situation. We had a 2-story building, was serving as it was originally historically a USO building. Last masonry structure constructed in the downtown area, and the property owner was rehabilitating the project and turning it into condominiums. In coming forward to the commission in a pre-application, this was not yet fully in front of the commission, but sitting down with the staff and then taking it to a informal consultation with the Historic Preservation Commission, we discussed we were in the midst of developing our resilience plan for the city dock area in Annapolis. And we indicated the fact that this particular property was right there on the fringe, and based on our projections for 1% chance or the 100-year, that the property would be within that envelope. So we discussed some design options with him because obviously he didn't want any flooding in his new condo.
Right.
And we came up with it all from his architect, but we could do raised terraces around the base of the property that would serve as flood walls. And so, in other words, we didn't have a specific set of design guidelines at that point for dealing with this, but instead by sitting with the property owner and the architect and the staff, and because we knew what the floodplain management ordinance said also, and we knew what they would have to do to mitigate or minimize risk, they added that feature as a protective measure. So I think that you can move and you should move forward. There is some basic guidance the HTC could use, but I think really sometimes this is where you have some wonderful staff that can work with that property owner, point out what is in the existing National Park Service flood adaptation guidance, and then let the architect do their job of designing something that would be compatible with that guidance, because that's pretty much what Phil will talk about next in terms of how we build these local guidelines. Holly, I'm sorry if I stepped on your toes in any way, but that was my example. I don't want you to get in trouble on talking about a pending project.
Thank you, Lisa. No, I agree completely. It looks like we have another question, if that's okay with you, Phil, or do we want to move forward?
I'll go ahead. That's fine.
Okay. Lucy?
Can you hear me, Holly?
I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. My question is, especially with the price of real estate on Nantucket, that many people are maxing out the building on their lots. And that with the combination of hardscaping is not allowing enough percolation into the soil, and how that is affecting some areas of downtown, not necessarily with flooding, but just from rains. Thank you.
Well, I would say, the design guidelines that we have worked on for other coastal communities, really recommending permeable paving surfaces and getting away from, the asphalt, the concrete, the really hard surfaces that just exacerbate water runoff. So that's something that we've written into a number of the design guidelines we've worked on, and certainly look at that approach for Nantucket. And I understand the issue too of taking, backyard space or whatever, and as you maximize your lot, and if you're within the setback requirements and everything, putting on a large rear addition or whatever to the house, but there are ways that you can try to do mitigation with that, again, through more permeable surfaces or integration of more appropriate landscaping and that sort of thing. So those are going to be issues in the guidelines that we work on in the publication for you. And let me also say that all of these design guideline manuals that we have updated or prepared, these then go through a regulatory process where they are adopted by the city or by the town. So what that gives you then are the kind of the legal basis then for decisions, as opposed to, well, I like this or I don't like this. You can say, well, we are making our decision as the Historic District Commission based on the following guidelines. Guideline 1, 2, or 3 out of this particular design guideline element. So there is that process of creating a design guideline manual that will be recommended and adopted by the town. So again, it gives you a much stronger sort of legal basis then for your decisions in the future. So if there's no other questions, why don't we take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and look at the National Park Service design guidelines for flood adaptation and how they can be relevant to Nantucket. Holly, just let me know whenever you want to start again.
Holly, I'm ready to share whenever you are, so,
Sounds
So
good.
This is the NPS guidelines one, right?
right.
Very good.
Okay, let me myself.
Ready when you are, Phil.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. And back for the second presentation here. And this is the going into more detail with the National Park Service guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. Once we started doing the elevation projects, we really started to see that, we need some guidance on this, and how do we not only elevation, but also hardening of our buildings. So the National Park Service did work for a number of years then on looking at best practices and preparing this new set of design guidelines that came out just last year. So they're relatively new, and they are working also on a manual that will be more illustrative in nature. Right now, all we have are the narrative guidelines, but they want to move into something that has a lot of photographs and drawings. So, but the goal of the guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings is to provide information about how to adapt historic buildings to be more resilient to flooding risk in a manner that will preserve their historic character and that will meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. These guidelines should be used in conjunction with the guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings that are part of the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, with guidelines for preserving, rehabilitating, restoring, and reconstructing historic buildings issued in 2017. And that's that publication I showed to you in the last presentation. Like the guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings, these guidelines are intended to focus primarily on historic buildings and their site and setting. So let me just sort of go through the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation and kind of where we've gotten hung up in some places in trying to adapt these with flood mitigation. So these standards came out, decades ago and have been refined a little bit, but the standards are: a property will be used as it was historically or be given a new use that requires minimal changes to its distinctive materials, features, spaces, and spatial relationships. The historic character of a property will be retained and preserved. The removal of distinctive materials or alteration of features, spaces, and spatial relationships that characterize a property will be avoided. And that can be difficult sometimes with these elevation projects of, the spatial relationship, especially from, its setting and from the lot that it's on and its relationship to the street. Each property will be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or elements from other historic properties, will not be undertaken. Changes to a property that have acquired historic significance in their own right will be retained and preserved. Distinctive materials, features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property will be preserved. And that can get into some of the issues with, foundations and chimneys, as you just mentioned. So yeah, there are some issues there about how do you preserve and maintain those kind of features. Deteriorated historic features will be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature will match the old in design, color, texture, and where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features will be substantiated by documentary and physical evidence. The materials aspect can be an issue here too. If you're looking at doing some replacement with flood-resistant materials as opposed to being able to go back with original materials. Chemical or physical treatments, if appropriate, will be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. Treatments that cause damage to historic materials will not be used. Archaeological resources will be protected and preserved in place. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures will be undertaken. New additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction will not destroy historic materials, features, and spatial relationships that characterize the property. The new work will be differentiated from the old and will be compatible with the historic materials, features, size, scale, and proportion, and massing to protect the integrity of the property and its environment. And again, you can see here how the spatial relationship issue would come about with elevation and hardening also, where you're adding additional material changes to the exterior of a commercial building, for example. The new additions and adjacent or related new construction will be undertaken in such a manner that, if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. Again, I mentioned these 10 different standards just because then this is the basis that the National Park Service has been working from for decades. And now we have to move into how the flood adaptation guidelines really interrelate with the Secretary of the Interior standards.
Bill, if I might just add too,
Yeah.
for purposes of those that are with the HDC or anybody who has brought a project in front of the HDC for review, these are the baseline standards by which the Historic District Commission needs to make its decision. And sometimes in a location, I know Annapolis was similar in terms of a higher standard of review than the basic standard of the National Park Service. So I think you're absolutely right in starting off with that, because it's the foundation upon which these flood adaptation strategies, both at the Park Service and at the local level with Nantucket, begin. But stricter than is the purview of a local commission if they choose. And that is the difficult decision that needs to be made in the next couple of months here, and developing and adapting the design guidelines, or adopting the design guidelines. So thanks, Bill, for incorporating that.
And let me also mention that these standards are also used by the National Park Service for tax certification projects. And we are still sort of wondering on some of these elevation and adaptation projects, if the changes and alterations to the buildings will meet that criteria. So can a property owner who has to do elevation to meet the FEMA guidelines and firm guidelines, can that person take the federal tax credit? And sometimes we also have states that have state historic preservation tax credits, can take those tax credits as part of that project. And the Technical Preservation Services branch of the National Park Service, they're still working on guidelines for us, and we just don't know where that's going to go. So anyway, that's just another issue to think about as you look at the established standards and then what the flood adaptation guidelines will say. So the first part of these guidelines, they get into planning. Really want you to plan your project. So identify historic materials, features, and spaces that are important in defining the historic character of the property when planning and undertaking flooding adaptation treatments. Develop and implement a plan to reduce the risk or damage or destruction to the historic building. Undertake work to prevent or minimize the loss, damage, or destruction of the historic property, while retaining and preserving significant features and the overall historic character of the building, its site, and setting. Ensure that when planning work to adapt for flooding, all feasible alternatives are considered, and that the options requiring the least alteration are considered first. So planning, maintain, and repair historic materials. I mean, it's quite an issue in constant flooding kind of issues. So you look at something like all the our historic cities around the world, like Venice, and the problems they have with the constant flooding and the deterioration of brick and mortar, like you see here. And that's not, of course, confined to the older cities. This is in Georgetown, South Carolina, where this building has been flooded so often that the brick basically is melting, and the hard mortar is what's holding the building together at this point. So you really got to look at your materials. And then in planning, design a new new construction, new residential construction or commercial construction. How do you design these kind of buildings to still feel like they are compatible with the historic commercial buildings up and down the street? So this is an example here in Brunswick, Georgia, where you have obviously a hardened storefront. This is all cast concrete here that's under the display windows, but the display windows, continue that sort of tradition of the open transparency of our historic storefronts. But then we do have, a staircase that leads up to the front door, which is elevated. Now there is an ADA compliant ramp, which is on the side of this building. So there is ADA access that you have. But this is one example of a new infill commercial building that was approved in this historic district. And this is an adjacent building, part of that same complex, but you can see the stairs going to an elevated entrance. The design, which I think is a little bit more compatible here under the display windows with these concrete panels that are almost mimicking frame lower panels, or frame bulkheads, as we also call them, under the storefront. So this is, but again, designed to be flood resistant. It's right downtown next to their harbor. And some other examples here. Again, this is designing a new commercial building to be flood resistant with the tile, which is another good flood resistant material, here on the storefront below the display windows. And they would have the ability here with the entrance to put in one of the protective shields when there's high water. So this is an example of, I think, a successful design for this building. Another example where for new construction, new commercial building, where you can simply just provide an elevation situation with water resistant materials here with the concrete and brick, and a way of providing flood proofing here. And there would be, again, an ADA compliant way of getting in these buildings, either on a side elevation or a rear elevation. So, and this is a commercial building too, but it's a commercial building that's on the edge of a historic district, or in the historic district, but next to a waterfront, and designed to be flood resistant. And so what you see here, you see on the left side, the elevated HVAC unit. You have the pier foundation with the lattice, not lattice, but the horizontal slat panels underneath, and designed to fit into the historic streetscape for this community in Georgetown, South Carolina. So I think this kind of design works pretty well. Multifamily housing in this instance, where again, just the entire grade is raised enough, and you have these flood resistant materials of the landscaping, the little skirt walls that you've got for the landscaped beds, and again, brick construction. The entrances are elevated with the concrete stairs. So this just gets back to the overall emphasis on planning of how do you make new construction as flood resistant as possible. We also have in the planning guidelines, replace damaged or deteriorated historic materials in kind where the traditional material is flood damage resistant, or replace damaged or deteriorated historic materials that are not resilient to flooding with proven flood damage resistant substitute materials that match the appearance and design. So here we have, also back in Brunswick, Georgia, this is a new storefront that's designed with flood resistant materials. And the original storefront was long removed, and so they had like a replacement storefront there. The cast iron columns that you see are, of course, original, but everything else is rebuilt. And what you have in terms of the lower panels that the display windows are resting on, next slide. Here we go. This, so you've got, this is concrete. So, flood resistant, the cast iron's flood resistant, and then you can put in the protective shields at the entrance to the building. So, this is still kind of in process, but they can paint this out, and it can be a lot more compatible. And another approach with a storefront like this is to you can design a frame sort of panel that will fit over it. So it looks more in the historic character of the storefront, but that's another way that you can, something that's you can remove and put back after any kind of high water. So other guidelines are temporary protective measures. So select a temporary barrier system or equipment that will protect the historic building from the predicted type of flooding, and that can be deployed using the labor, equipment, and warning time available. Evaluate and ensure the ability of masonry walls and temporary flood barriers or other systems covering masonry openings to withstand the forces of flooding, and reinforce walls as necessary to withstand such forces. So this gets to, various types of flood panels and flood barriers that are out there. And again, just think about in your community, in your historic districts, do you have the ability to build any kind of perimeter wall that would be appropriate that you could then protect with, installing these kind of temporary flood barriers like you have here on the left side. And then on the right, this gets back to, again, those water-filled kind of barriers that you could put around a property, around a house, or around 2 or 3 houses in a row if you wanted to do that, or around your outbuildings as well. So these are a couple of approaches that are in the NPS guidelines, and just want to see if anybody has any thoughts about these kind of measures, and would they be appropriate in the historic districts? Anybody want to make a comment on this? Okay, move on.
Oh, yeah, we
And-
got some hands raised.
Go ahead.
So first, we actually have 2 hands raised, one from Mary and one from Diane. So I'll take Mary first.
Hi, good morning. I have 2 questions. One, specifically to your question about the walls. Is there a height at which walls do not become an effective solution? I'm looking at the pictures and seeing most of these are river or ice melt flooding, it looks like, but we're in a coastal situation where we have not only floodwaters, but waves and potential for sea level rise. So I'm just wondering if you have sort of a height in mind where this kind of a project is not really a long-term solution. And then I have a second question, if you'll let me.
Yes, these are really for water levels of about 3 to 4 feet. Anything above that, they're not going to be very useful.
Thank you. The second question was going back to your comments about the National Park Service standards and that they're working on how to adapt those for flooding situations. Are they looking at the potential for sea level rise and for other climate change effects like more intense storms and higher rainfall totals in the future as they're considering the adaptation guidelines, or are they just looking at current conditions?
No, I think the guidelines are to be, viewed and applied with just the various intensities that we're looking at in the future, and looking at the options that we have. And that's the other thing that, some of the guideline documents that Boston and Schenectady and all those kind of communities, you look at, okay, the low level kind of adaptation, and then you go higher and higher, and sort of where we are, where elevation just doesn't make any sense anymore, and then you've got to look at relocation or retreat. So the National Park Service guidelines do have a whole series of different scenarios that they are looking at and are being reflected in their design guidelines. And I'm sure we'll have many examples that they will be showing when they get into the illustrative manual that will be coming out hopefully in the next year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And then we have one other question, Phil. It's from Diane.
I wanted
Diane,
to, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
On the downtown area, as Mary brought up, we have coastal flooding. In the HDC, most of the buildings that are brought to us that are in a flood zone, lift the building. That's it, between 4 to 6 feet. I think we did one building that was 8 feet. That's usually in area A and B, as far as the flood zoning is concerned. That seems to be all that we do. I live downtown on a street that was flooded on the No Name store, and it's an old house and it has an 8-foot deep basement. And when the water came in, it came in through the basement and out the windows. And we didn't have any idea about that storm, so it came in. Now, a lot of people along these particular streets use sandbags as protection. Do you think sandbags form a protection that will last during the coming and going of a storm?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of sandbag use for any flooding situation, and I think as a temporary measure, it's fine and certainly effective. But I don't think sandbagging is a long-term solution. So I think you've got to look at just your various options for adaptation and work with what makes the most sense for your particular property. So. Again, these guidelines have a whole series of recommendations, and we've got a few more coming up that may be more relevant to your house. So,
well, I wasn't thinking just of my house. I was thinking of the downtown area that runs from Union Street down to Washington. Orange Street, which is another one of our historic streets, is up too high. It's up on a bank. So it's the lower ones, because we don't have very many concrete cement buildings downtown in the old historic district. So we have to look at some solution to doing those buildings that are down on Main Street, South Water Street, and going down to the beach. It's the area that is considered A, B, and C on the floodplain, not just my house. I just was using as an example of what can happen. But what I've seen proposed today could not be looked at as a long-term basis and try and keep our buildings, which I think the park thing is very good. I hope it comes out very soon. There are all sorts of things that need to be read by people who are doing this. So that's what I just wanted to think what would work in an area that is technically almost 80% shingles. And the brick buildings are quite substantial. And our electric company down on C Street, we approved stuff to keep them flood proof, obviously. So we did work with brick buildings, but it's the amount of shingle buildings that are right down there that's a really big problem. Thank you.
Sure. Yes, and just keep that thought in mind as we go through, this presentation, because we've got another series of sort of, options and adaptation strategies here. So.
And yeah, Phil, to that point, and Diane, thanks for bringing that up. I think this echoes a little what we heard yesterday in the camp training. I think realizing that there are temporary versus more permanent options, which Phil will get into, but also the fact that coming to the HGC, applicants may have a particular proposal and they may believe that elevation is the only way to go, or they're working with a design team that is most comfortable and experienced with that. But you're absolutely right. That's why we're going through these series of adaptive measures, because it may be that there are other things that could be done if, for example, looking at a packet of information, you have an elevation, flood elevation certificate that doesn't really demonstrate that the property would perhaps need to be raised more than, a couple of feet versus elevating it much higher. However, you are always challenged by the fact that you have an applicant that comes in with an application. You must address that application. We're hoping this educational process, that these design guidelines and this continuing work on resilient Nantucket through public forums, and certainly the Coastal Resilience Plan, will do our better job of educating the public about the variety of options. And I'm a very strong believer in nature-based approaches, because protecting historic buildings starts by looking at the setting and the landscape. And I think that is one of the reasons Nantucket is a National Historic Landmark, because of its natural heritage. So I'll let Phil go from there, but it is a balancing act, Diane, and we have to look at the property owner's intentions and desires within the historic criteria. So Phil, should I go on to the next slide?
Yes, please. Yeah, so again, use of flood shields. This is in Venice, and you can see where, you've got these little side stanchions at the doors, and then you just fit the temporary flood panel in. So you see that in all throughout Venice. And also want to just mention, Venice, I was there in February, right before, the pandemic and everything, managed to have a very enjoyable time. But they have spent billions of dollars on what's called the Mose project, which is a series of floodgates at the mouth of their lagoon. And they tried it out for the first time, a month or so ago, and it actually worked. So, that's a very drastic and very expensive planning process and engineering process to go through. But for all of us who love, that city, it was just very reassuring to see that maybe this will actually work. Anyway, next. Okay. So then we look at site and landscaping adaptations. Identify, retain, and preserve features of the historic site and setting that are important in defining its overall historic character before undertaking site mitigation work or changing the landscape or its features. Retain the topography and historic relationship between buildings and the site and setting. Select new infrastructure that is able to retain floodwaters on site, such as a cistern, bioswale, permeable pavers, green roofing, and associated rain collection systems. So then we see these kind of adaptations. So you have On the left side, instead of like a hard kind of sidewalk area or just a very plain kind of grass median, you have instead natural landscaping using plantings that assist in absorbing water and direct the water into the storm drain, like you see here. And then shoreline stabilization, where you're putting the native grasses back into your sand dunes to try to prevent further erosion and make sure that you stabilize your shoreline as much as possible. So there's various natural ways that you can approach this. And then we have also permeable paving surfaces. This is more widespread now than in the past, and where these kind of paving materials still provide enough, the surface is fine for parking and walking and all that sort of thing, but they do allow for good absorption. This is a driveway here in this historic district on the right-hand side in Brunswick, where you put these pavers in, and hasn't had any problems over the last 10 to 15 years that they've been installed. So it's not just for sidewalks or your walkways, but certainly driveways and parking situations. And then just another example here of the different types of designs that you've got. These can be textured and colored in a lot of different ways. So it doesn't. So you're not dealing with, an appearance of just hard concrete or hard asphalt. So I think these are very appropriate and work pretty well in our historic districts and certainly help with the water runoff situation. Other adaptations: construct a levee, berm, or embankment on adjacent or nearby land outside the historic site or district to minimize impacts to the character of the historic property and increase the area protection for the historic site or district. Or design a new flood wall or berm, or improve an existing barrier to provide flooding protection to a historic site. So this is an example here of installing an earth berm flood wall. I mean, the water is obviously on the other side of the wall here, but it's just a way of really utilizing more of the natural features than the kind of the historic concrete barriers that a lot of our communities have. I mean, if you go up and down the Mississippi or Ohio rivers, a lot of these communities have these very imposing floodgates and flood walls, and really cut you off from the water, and do it in a way that is just a very hardscape as opposed to using these kind of features. And this is from some planning work in New York City, where they are looking at installing earth berm flood walls as protection all along their waterfronts. And a lot of lower New York is pretty vulnerable to flooding. And so as they look at the sea level rise issues, they're looking at what they can do to almost recreate this natural harbor kind of feel, and at the same time provide the pedestrian opportunities and to keep the water away, but to protect the downtown areas. Then you have utility protection. Relocate all utilities above the established flood risk level, or protect them in place with a watertight or impermeable enclosure. Relocate and anchor exterior mechanical equipment and fuel tanks to an elevated platform that is compatible with the building's historic character and is preferably on a secondary or otherwise less visible elevation. And use fencing or landscaping to screen exterior mechanical equipment and reduce its visibility. So here's examples of elevated units. You got them just up, off the ground, up on platforms, screening, fencing there on the right-hand side. And these are what I would call low elevation, projects, or where, their BFE may be, fairly low. But then you get into the higher BFE designs. And, this is, got to make sure that these are on secondary elevations. I mean, we've written design guidelines for these in a number of communities. And, they've got to be on secondary or hopefully out of sight kind of elevations. And we certainly encourage screening, although the screening of these kind of units, can be challenging given their height, but can be done. And some other examples here of the elevation. And also you got to keep in mind that, they've got to be serviced every once in a while. So you got to have a ladder or some sort of access to get to these units. And again, here's some screening that I think is effective. This is a unit on the rear of this building with the fencing, and then utilizing some more fencing and landscaping with the unit on the right. But these are, it's a challenge. I mean, where you put these and how you screen them, and but you've got to get them off the ground. They've got to go up high in some cases.
Bill,
And then,
ask
yes.
just a question. Holly, does the commission review mechanical units? Do they review the placement of those?
They
Okay.
do review HVAC. Those have been coming in quite a bit, and they request them to be masked as much as possible.
Okay. All right. So I think this is very relevant because it's usually the first go-to, wouldn't you say, Phil, of most property owners. I got to get my utilities and mechanicals out of harm's way.
Yes, yeah. And in all these communities I've worked in, the mechanical units and HVAC, all that is under review, and they do have a voice in where approval or non-approval of where these go, and recommend screening of some type. So then we go to look at interiors, relocate interior mechanical equipment to utilitarian or insignificant spaces within the building that are unlikely to flood. And just where you relocate your ducts, pipes, and conduits, and conceal them in the walls or attic. So this is an attic space example where the units are under the eaves of the house here, but a way of just getting them out of the basement and moving them to the upper floor areas. You can use a utility room on the first floor or second floor for these kind of units too. Caution with when you move like hot water heaters and things like that to upper floors, just make sure that those are in some sort of protective enclosure, just in case of failure with those kind of units, so you don't end up with an interior flood. So one of the, there's dry flood proofing and wet flood proofing, and these are addressed in great detail in the NPS guidelines. So with dry flood proofing, evaluate the strength of masonry walls and footings of historic buildings to ensure that they're strong enough to withstand flood water pressure and flood-borne debris. And again, dry flood proofing is basically keeping the water out of your building, out of your basement, out of everything. Anchor the structure to the foundation with appropriate placement and engineering to prevent movement or collapse of the historic building. Prepare to effectively manage the incoming floodwaters and addressing moving and removing the water from the site and historic building area after the flooding. So this is a very simple little diagram, but it just shows, some dry flood proofing approaches where you've got the flood shields at your openings, you've got some sort of skirt wall or coating or covering impervious to flood water. And again, this would be for the low kind of flooding of, maybe 3 to 4 feet, something like that. And then a backflow valve, which prevents sewer and drain backup. So with dry flood proofing, you're just wanting to keep the water out as much as possible.
I think
so you look at other guidelines, then design temporary or permanent enclosures for all openings, i.e. windows and doors, that are below or extend into the established flood risk level while maintaining the historic character of the building. Install stanchions, fasteners, or tracks for flood shields in concealed or secondary locations and in a manner that does not damage, alter, or otherwise impact the historic character of the property. Build a low wall that is compatible with the historic building around basement windows to keep floodwaters out. So again, we've seen these shields, and these can be fairly substantial, and again are temporary. Just you bring them out when needed, and again can be effective with floods that are in the 3, 4, 5 foot range, something like that. So this is an example of how those are used. And then you had a project in Nantucket recently, which is the C Street Pump Station. And I think this is a real good example, and I will be using this example in my future guidelines, I think, of effective dry flood proofing, because the way this was done, you go next, you've got the interior where you've got the mechanical units that are really important. You relocated those outside on a raised platform. And you've got pump mechanisms which can get wet or are elevated above the floor. So that works. And then go to next. Then you see what this brick skirt wall that was built around the building to help keep the water out, and then the flood shields that can be installed when needed at your entrances. So I think this is a good approach and good example here of the dry flood proofing that you can do for certainly a very important utility building like you have here. So this is an example of something that's been, I think, pretty effective. In contrast to dry flood proofing, we have wet flood proofing, which allows the water to come into the building, but then exits the building without damage, or hopefully damage that can be readily repaired or cleaned. So with wet flood proofing, follow the recommended structural engineering guidance for the number, size, and placement of hydrostatic flood vents, as well as any other ventilation requirements. Retain historic foundation vents in highly visible locations where feasible. And we do have any number of designs for historic foundation vents in many of our communities. Select a compatible design and placement for new vents or painting vents to blend in with the foundation material, and install a pumping system for draining the building in concert with the receding waters outside the property. So this is kind of another diagram of wet flood proofing, where you let the water flow through. So you're relocating the utilities from the basement into a interior utility space. You have your flood vents that have to be 1 foot above grade, and you put in the number of flood vents are determined by the square footage of your basement and the calculated water flow that you've got. Your front door is above the base flood elevation. And so you're just letting basically the water flow through your crawl space or your basement space, and utilize that technique. And as you look at the flood vents, again, on the left, if you don't have flood vents, you've got the flood water pressure that's pushing against your wall, and you don't want that, and you can get water seepage in. Then on the right-hand side, you're equalizing the flood forces through your flood vents and just letting the exterior flood level be the same as the interior flood level, again, in a crawl space or a basement area. And this is another example of where your flood vents just need to be at least, they need to be 1 foot above grade. And, this is a masonry wall on the left or a brick wall on the right, and then letting the water flow through. So you've got, the left illustration would be, for like a ranch house or something like that. the middle of this kind of honeycomb or pierced brick. That's very appropriate for a lot of historic buildings. And then just the typical sort of metal flood panels that you've got, the flood vents there on the right-hand side. So if you do not have the equal flood, the water pressure on the interior or exterior, you can lose your foundation wall like the building there on the left. The building on the right, what you're seeing is, this is a retrofit of a historic building. And this is in Beaufort, North Carolina, where they elevated maybe about 3 feet, you see here, but you see all of the different kind of flood vents that they have installed that are essentially like louvers and these horizontal slats. And it's just designed to let the water flow through as needed through that space. And this is an example of retrofitting a house with flood vents where you are cutting into the brick foundation. And I know in Nantucket, you've got a lot of stone foundations, and it may cause more of a challenge in terms of creating these kind of flood vents. But certainly with brick foundations, you just cut these out and then install these kind of metal vents like you see here. So this is an example of a retrofit on this building. And this is an example, sort of ultimate wet flood proofing. This is a community building that's next to the Mississippi River in Iowa, and it's where it's just designed to flood. I mean, when it happens, you get high water. It's got a concrete floor, and the water comes in through the flood panels, like you see there, and then the water just goes out, and they come in and hose the interior down and reuse it when they can, and when the water is not very high. But this is an example of just trying to live with the water and doing your best to make sure that your interior historic elements are as flood resistant as possible, and the building can be reused. So then we look at wet flood proofing on the interior. Retain historic materials, features, and finishes that are flood damage resistant. Remove non-historic finishes and furnishings that absorb and trap moisture. Use substitute materials that are more flood damage resistant when replacing deteriorated or destroyed historic materials and features that are compatible with the historic character of the building. Replace character defining features with a substitute material that matches the design and appearance of the historic component, and relocate, if necessary, electrical outlets and panels above the established flood risk level in a manner compatible with the historic character of the building. So this is an example here where you retrofit with water-resistant materials. And for the first floors of our historic houses, we may be pretty reluctant to do that because of, you've got these great character-defining features. But there may be other properties that, this is a workable and a good alternative, where you put in water-resistant wallboard and baseboard, you have a water-resistant tile floor, or the marine grade wood floor. You elevate your wall outlets, and you put in chair rails to prevent wicking of the moisture above the water-resistant wallboard below. So this is one approach that you can take. And this is an example here. This is in Georgetown, South Carolina, where I worked. And this is a building with repeated flooding. And that's exactly what they're doing here. This is where they will be relocating the electrical outlets up the wall. You can see where they're cut out the drywall, and they'll put in more water-resistant drywall here. And then what they're doing is taking up the floor that's had repeated flooding and are going to be putting down a marine grade wood floor that can dry out and be reused. And as I mentioned again, the FEMA has just a whole category of the water resistant materials. And so I certainly encourage you to get that publication. Another flood adaptation guideline is fill the basement. And that's assess the strength of basement walls and footings to ensure they are strong enough to support the fill after it is compacted. modify and anchor basement walls and footings when necessary to provide enough strength to support the fill, as long as the modifications do not significantly alter the visible exterior portions of the foundation. Remove or break up non-porous or concrete basement floor slabs prior to adding fill or creating drainage holes and trenches in the existing floor while still protecting the foundations and footings. So this adaptation guideline, again, use a fill material such as gravel, soil, or sand that can be removed in the future. Compact the fill so that it protects the basement adequately from water entering the space. Fill the basement to the required fill height, which is equal to the surrounding ground level. And of course, relocate all your utilities and HVAC above to a secondary interior space or above, like we showed before. So one thing I have noticed at looking at, your historic properties is, that's going to be a challenge for this particular adaptation because, I think you utilize these basements, and the basement windows are important visual aspects to the character of these houses. So, any thoughts that you might have about this? Have you or your neighbors or anyone you've known undertaken this kind of project of filling the basement? Or if you have any questions on the dry or wet flood proofing that we've discussed, now might be a time to ask any questions.
Bill, we have two hands raised, one from Diane and one from Hillary. So let me get Diane. All right.
I would like to ask Phil if using the windows the way you see, because this is 29 Union Street, this is a street on which I live also, could they not in a position use those windows as the water through vent rather than putting on the louvered vents?
I think that's a possibility, and it's something I'm going to be looking into about, if there's anybody who's come up with any kind of designs like this. The main thing is that these kind of flood panels, lattice panels, any kind of panels have to be what we call breakaway. And that means that they can't be in a fixed position. They have to be able, when water comes up, they have to be able to rotate out and allow the water to flow through. But I think that's an intriguing, idea about designing what looks like a traditional sash window like you have here, but design it in a way maybe where it's hinged at what might be, like the meeting rail location, and have it hinged almost like like the hopper and awning windows do in our historic buildings. So yeah, that's really
my
interesting.
window on Fayette Street, which is a street that comes up to Union, on the corner window has a window that looks like a double hung window, but it moves as a whole thing and opens up. I wondered if we could maybe work with a window company to see what they could come with, because they would keep our historic area a little more historic looking than putting in the vents. I think that's just a suggestion, but I think it might be worth looking into.
Yeah, I agree, and I will certainly take a look at that detail when I come this next week.
I think too that is a fire egress issue too, Diane. It's, can you get out of that? Is the opening large enough? And so, our friends in the fire marshal's office usually are the ones that say, you can't do that double hung, but you can make it look like a double hung as long as you can open it. So there may be some implications here in terms of cross purposes, or actually collaborative purposes for this same type of solution. I think that's a very solid point.
Right. I put it on quite a few years ago. I did have some people living in the basement in the old days before the water level came up. And it is large enough because it is the size of a typical basement window. It's not smaller or anything. It looks just like a window. So come by sometime if you want to see it. It certainly would answer a lot of our historical questions about the facades of buildings. On the side or the back is not so much, but the facade going down Union or Washington or any of the others would be much improved, not having all those shuttered things.
Yes.
Make it easier.
Diane. Oops. Cut you off, I'm sorry. Time for more questions, Phil?
Yeah, I think you said, did you have another hand raised?
I have 2 more hands raised, yes.
Okay,
Right,
sure,
we'll
go
go
ahead.
to Hillary.
Hi, Holly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
We can hear you.
Great. Phil, I just wanted to ask that plaster be considered. A lot of our historic buildings have plaster walls and lath walls, and just assessing the attractiveness of this as a flood resistant material, which I understand it is. So that might encourage, we might be able with guidelines to educate folks that this is an attractive material to retain in their house. And that might help with some of the interior preservation we'd like to encourage.
Yes, that is correct. And yeah, we will have an emphasis on that because, plaster gets wet, but but you bring in the blowers and you dry them out, and typically plaster will dry out well and be able to be retained. That's a good point. But yes, our plaster walls are good insulators. The plaster, is a long-lasting material, and it is pretty water resistant. It's a good point.
I have one other point, if I have time to make it. You talked about the permeability of surfaces just for the natural environment. We have a lot of cobblestone and a main corridor on a hill that at this point has been largely repaved with highly compacted stone dust. But that doesn't have to be the case. In fact, the Historical Commission just received a wonderful report, which is available, but not yet published on our website. So we'll make it more widely available, looking at different settings for cobblestone, including going back to a mix of sand and clay that would be more permeable than stone dust. But we have a lot of runoff that collects on Main Street, and you'll see, as you did last week, that Main Street just turns into a river running down into the more flooded areas of town. And just thinking about what kind of community support we could have for getting away from the compacted stone dust with our natural stone streets.
Yeah, the streetscape issue is pretty important, and retaining original materials, or how do you adapt materials that are going to be a lot more compatible with your historic streetscape. So it's good to hear that you're dealing with those issues. Okay, any other questions?
Okay, we do. Looks like Mary. Mute you. Disappeared. Hold on 1 second.
Holly, do you want to move on here?
I got one more.
Okay, go ahead.
Mary, you're on.
Thank you. So following up on what Diane mentioned, and for Phil's benefit, a lot of our basements are separate dwelling units. They've been converted to either help the owners afford to keep their homes or to provide housing for people who can't afford an entire home of their own. And so I wonder if you have experience in that sort of conflict between floodproofing and the fact that it might be a separate dwelling unit, not just an extension of the living space of the rest of the home. The other question is, and Holly might be able to comment on this, it was my understanding, and I'm asking because I certainly could be wrong, that wet floodproofing is not allowed in Massachusetts in residential buildings. And I'd be happy to be told I'm wrong, but I just wanted to bring that up as a question. Thank you.
I'm not aware of that situation of not being allowed in residential buildings. I think the Boston guidelines address that. And but back to your original question about, yeah, using the basement space, then yeah, wet floodproofing may not be a real option. You might need to just look at, you know, dry floodproofing, as well as what you can do with drainage issues and that sort of thing on the perimeter of your building. So yeah, I see from a lot of photographs that I've reviewed on your historic district that most of the basement space looks like it's habited. It's used as living space. And you know, that's just something that we'll need to write specific guidelines for, I think, for those kind of spaces.
Thank you.
Okay. One more, there we go. Okay. So then we get to elevation. The guidelines that the NPS has: identify, retain, and preserve materials and features of the building that are important in defining its overall historic character before elevating the building. Assess the impact of elevating a building on its historic character, including the aspects of the site, setting, and design of the property. Elevate later additions and porches that also contribute to the historic significance of the building, along with the main structure. So here we go. Here's the challenge: how to elevate and retain historic integrity. So you look at these different the diagram on the left, where you're raising, maybe a foot, 2 feet, then you go up 3 feet to 4 feet, and then above that 6 feet and above. And the house on the right, this is back to that house in Mandeville that, when I show this to a lot of historic preservation commissions or historic district commissions, they all sort of just shudder and, gosh, how could that still be a contributing property to the historic district? But this is just kind of the reality that the folks in the Mandeville Historic District had to deal with, of elevating this high in order to be able to afford to still live in their houses. So, Mandeville and Biloxi, a number of other communities all along the Gulf Coast and some on the Atlantic coast, we just had to look at successes or failures. And here's the house again, a little bit more detail. The house in Mandeville. Next slide. There we go. And you see what the attempts of trying to do this again with the piers, the lattice panels underneath, you break up the stair with a landing, on the way up. So we end up with these kind of situations. And I'll just go through, it's kind of a series here of these. And, where, a lot of this, for Mandeville and these other historic preservation commissions, historic district commissions, kind of trial and error. What is working and what isn't after we do this elevation and we see the results. So here you've lifted this building up, and again, this is anywhere from 7 feet to 9 feet up in the air. And you want to make sure that your porch columns are aligned with your foundation piers, and the foundation piers can be of brick or concrete, can be steel too, as long as the steel is wrapped in some kind of appropriate material. The stairs where you've got landings that are broken up, break up the stair run, and this orientation that you still have the front door oriented towards the street, as opposed to, and I've showed this one before, where it meets none of this criteria, and this would be considered a real failure looking back at it, because the porch columns and the piers don't line up. There's no orientation to the street. You got this little side stair. that's completely inappropriate in its design. So, there again, this experimentation with really what works and what doesn't. And Charleston is going through the same thing. Now that they are allowing elevation, how do you elevate and retain historic integrity? So this is one where, they feel like this works okay. They've had to do some elevation here. The door is still at the ground level, but you open the door and obviously you go upstairs to get into the first floor. And you see the flood panels, they're on the flood vents on the in the foundation. It's just a very simple sort of concrete parging or stucco wash on the foundation. The next image in Charleston would be considered not successful because you've got an inappropriate stair. It's not designed to be historically correct, a wood frame stair that would be in keeping with the streetscape elements up and down the street. The flood panels flood vents are oversized, and you really want to try to keep these minimal on your primary elevation and have them more on the secondary elevations or the rear elevation. So this would be considered not so successful. So with Mandeville, we went through with them with a whole series of low elevation project guidelines. And by low elevation, again, up to about 3 to 4 feet. So these are the kind of guidelines that we came up with them, like porch columns and foundation piers align. You've got a wide fascia board that clearly delineates the porch and the foundation piers below. You have a stair landing, which is at the level of the original porch, just to give it the right kind of scale and, and it's appropriately designed stair. Another example where your columns and foundation piers are in alignment. You've got the wide fascia board. The stair railing ends at the level of the original porch, and the brick stairs, in this case, match the design of the brick piers. Another example, and this is important too, where you have a side driveway and rear parking. You do not allow, parking, to be like in the front or front yards, whatever. But again, porch columns and piers align. You've got a wide staircase that leads to the front porch, and the fascia board. So these are just these kind of details, just to really preserve and maintain as much of this integrity as you can. And then we get into these high elevation project guidelines, which, it's just more challenging because you're bringing these up more like in a 7 foot to 9 foot range. So here you have this, 19 teens bungalow design at grade. You see it being elevated with the cribbing and jacks and, the final result there where it's up in the air side. And so this is the end result. Next slide. Yeah. The end result where, okay, so we've got these craftsman style porch columns. So let's just extend them down to the ground to unify them as this one pier. Then you have open risers on the stairs with a craftsman porch railing. You have lattice panels that are placed behind and between the brick piers and painted a dark color. And then the right kind of fascia board between the porch and the foundation. So, and also notice that the chimneys are still there. And that gets to where you have interior, you're separating the chimney from the ground, but you're keeping your chimney at the roof line. So next is a bungalow that's been elevated. And again, you've got the stair railing matching the original porch railing, a landing that lines up with the porch floor, and the craftsman columns are integrated into the new design with the extension of the brick all the way down to the ground. And this, these are buildings that are directly on the waterfront. And this bungalow was elevated while I was there doing my project because they just, they can't get insurance on this anymore, and they just don't have a choice but to elevate this. And this is the best context that they could come up with for this building. Another example here that you can do on some blocks, but I don't think would probably work too well with Nantucket, is where you're raising the grade, and where you're increasing you're elevating, but you're increasing the fill dirt underneath to get a little bit more elevation. But you can see again the same kind of techniques of rebuilding the wood staircase. The stone piers are extended to the ground, and that's where as part of the stone foundation, perimeter foundation, you're salvaging the stones to bring out to the front, the main facade. Slatted wood panels between the foundation piers, and again the fascia board. So those are just some examples of elevation. The guidelines get further into this, where you identify and retain the historic massing, scale, size, form, and proportional relationships of the major elements of the historic building and/or the historic district. Design a new foundation that preserves the historic character of the building. Use existing attributes and features such as large lot size, tall building height, visible foundation, porches or terraces, stairs and steps to minimize the impact of alterations to the historic character of the property. So another example of just where you're extending the porch elements, here's a bungalow. They're typically tapered wood posts on brick piers, and you're taking the brick piers, rebuilding them and extending them all the way down to the ground, as an example. Construct a new foundation that is compatible with the historic character of the building. Salvage and reuse historic materials and features like stone, brick, decorative vents, etc., from the historic foundation to construct the new foundation, particularly where visible on the primary elevation. Then match the new foundation to the visual characteristics of the historic foundation. So here's an example here. This is in Beaufort, North Carolina, where this was elevated. This would be kind of a low elevation, maybe 2.5 to 3 feet. And you're taking it off grade, you're raising it up, and then you're using brick piers, and then between you use what we call the honeycomb brick, which allows, this is a wet flood proofing. It allows the water to move through the crawl space beneath. So that's one example there. More guidelines. There's a lot of guidelines that they have for elevation, as you will see if you read these. And use creative design techniques to minimize the perception of the change in height and appearance of the foundation of the historic building where compatible. Create an illusion of solidity in tall open foundations by installing louvers or traditional lattice between piers or posts. Create an illusion of a shorter foundation in wood-clad buildings by lowering the transition point from visible foundation materials to siding or weatherboard. So that's where we get into the screening between pier foundations. These can be lattice panels. These can be horizontal louvered kind of panels. Again, an emphasis on this wide fascia board like you see on both of these properties below the porch and connecting down to the foundation to, again, get that sort of sense of solidity, I think, and connectiveness that you're looking for. And then, what do you do with the chimneys? Well, on the exterior wall chimneys, you basically keep them and add more brick and extend them all the way to the ground. And I know this looks a little odd, perhaps, and we're still sort of thinking through, is this the best approach? But this is a high elevation example here on the left, and then a low elevation example on the right, where you're salvaging as much brick as you can. Perhaps it had a brick foundation to begin with, and you salvage those materials when you're rebuilding these exterior wall chimneys. So, this is kind of a dilemma. And actually, the NPS guidelines, I've read them a couple of times, and they don't address chimneys yet. I think they're probably still trying to figure out what the best approach is also. And then, here's where you're just using new brick to rebuild the chimney on the left to match the new foundation brick below. And on an interior chimney, you're, detaching it from the ground, and but you're keeping the brick chimney or stone chimney, whatever chimney you've got, at the roof line. So these are, again, what we're sort of working with on these techniques. Install flood vents in solid foundation walls, reuse historic foundation vents in highly visible locations where feasible. Select a compatible design and placement for new vents, or paint vents to blend with the foundation material. So we've got examples in a number of the historic districts that I've worked on where you've got this tradition of the honeycomb brick or the pierced brick vents in the basement level or crawl space level like you see here. And I don't know if you have anything like that really. What I see certainly more in Nantucket as I look up and down the street are more of the solid foundation walls with the basement windows, or those, but maybe not quite this design element. Other things that you can look at that may be appropriate is installing decorative foundation flood vents. So that's another approach here that may be appropriate in some cases, as opposed to just the plain metal kind of vents that you might have. Okay, so bear with me. I know this is a lot of information on elevation, but it really is a substantial part of these guidelines. Retain a substantial visual connection of the building to the ground when using an open foundation type. Use piers, posts, or columns large enough in width or circumference to visually support the structure with the number and placement of piers, posts, or columns similar to that of traditional building practices, even if the new technology structurally requires fewer supports. So this is just where you get in with the foundation piers. You're using appropriate materials, historic materials as much as you can, like brick, like rock face concrete block. Use screening, lattice panels, different kind of panel designs. And then the other thing that you can do is also add screening, like in this case. Next slide, where you're using landscaping materials to screen these foundation piers as much as possible. So again, trying to keep the connection to the ground as much as you can. It's also important to retain the historic access locations and approach orientation to the building and its front or main entrance where feasible. Keep the physical features that identify the historic access points. Match new stairs, railings, or ramps with the style features of the historic design, and salvage and reuse historic features to the greatest extent possible. Construct railings with traditional proportions, or if a taller rail is necessary to meet code, retain a horizontal rail at the traditional railing height. Break up the run of stairs with a landing or change the design of materials where appropriate when a long run of stairs is required because of the change in elevation. So these are examples here where you're rebuilding the porch stairs. You've got a turn here, quarter turn here with a landing at the original porch location on the one on the left, and then a straight run of stairs on the right-hand side. And we developed a number of guidelines here for Mandeville with maintaining the front entrance, extending the stairs, and keeping that orientation to the street just as much as possible. So this was an important part of the guidelines that we developed there. And then the other thing is, especially with these high elevation projects, provide access via an exterior elevator, lift, or ramp located and designed to be compatible with the historic character of the property. Floodproof or locate the operating system of the elevator or lift above the established flood risk level. Minimize the impact of ramps by installing them on secondary elevations when it does not compromise accessibility, or by screening them with plantings on more visible locations. So here we've got a situation with ADA ramps that you can, you know, these are still viable, I think, for low elevation projects. Something like this on the left is not really compatible and should have been redesigned in a much more appropriate way with a rear entrance or whatever. The one on the right is a little bit better. This is at the rear of the building, so it's not directly on the front of this dwelling, and is a way of doing ADA on low elevation projects. But they really don't work on high elevation projects, and that's when you have to look at situations like, you know, chair lifts, like you see here. You know, this is for ADA compliance on any buildings you have in your historic district that requires ADA access, and you can't really do a ramp appropriately. So here you've got a designated ADA parking space, and you can get in this chairlift and get up to the porch and enter the building. So that, I think that one works pretty well. But then you get to these high elevation projects, and you know, you're looking at a substantial sum of money you've got to put into these chairlifts or elevators, and it's a challenge. You certainly don't want them on readily visible facades. I would certainly want to see this example recessed back to the corner or even on the rear. So it's just you know, pretty difficult to do those kind of ADA compliant elevator lifts and chair lifts. So then the other to look at, other option, you know, is alter the landscape by adding fill or constructing raised planters to reduce the amount of new foundation that is visible. Design new driveways, parking areas, or patios so they are not as unobtrusive as possible and are compatible with the historic character of the property in the district, and use permeable surfaces where possible. So we came up with a series of diagrams about, you know, no parking under the house from the front, that you need side or rear access. And then look at elevate buildings in historic districts that are similar in style and size to consistent heights, if that is the character of the district, while maintaining the historic spatial and architectural relationships between the buildings. And then in terms of interior elevation, maintain original entrances and fenestration patterns on the exterior of the building. Access to the new floor level from the original entrance level should generally be made on the interior of the building. Maintain storefront glass and bulkhead heights at their original locations. Retain original windows on primary or highly visible facades. Protect windows that extend below the established flood risk level with temporary waterproof coverings. Now, this is what we're talking about here, and I might just stop and just see, we're moving into where we're talking more about commercial buildings than residential. And I would, you know, just any comments about all this elevation of residential buildings and how practical, appropriate you see this for Nantucket? Anybody want to just chime in with opinions or thoughts about this, and, you know, the relevancy of, you know, low elevation or high elevation projects, and, you know, just what do you think? Anybody want to?
I have 3 hands raised.
All right, let's go.
All right, hold on here. I saw Val first. All right, Val.
Can you hear me?
And
Yes,
Holly?
go ahead.
yep, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So thank you for all the great information. I'm really enjoying this because we are in the trial and error phase as a commission. And we have just been raising buildings, but it's not our overall choice. We really do like the tiered approach, and you've shown some great examples of that today, whether it's a hard surface or with landscaping. But, you know, it's a collaborative effort, and what we've run into is that the local conservation commission does not like the tiered approach. So we are stuck with just the raising up at the moment and sort of mitigating what is closed in underneath with landscaping. You mentioned just now that the fill approach to sort of build up the lot or around the house, which is also an idea that is appealing, at least to me. But were there no restrictions where you did that, or did you? How did you get through that part of the process? Is one question I have, and then sorry, I have notes here to ask you. By lifting these houses, especially if they're historic and considered significant, do they lose their designation?
Okay, the first question about fill or terracing, raising the grade level itself. I don't think that's real practical in a dense urban historic district, because all you're doing in that case, and I don't think that meets FEMA requirements, because all you're doing is dispersing the water on your property to the properties next door to you, and that's not alleviating the flooding issues. I think it can be a good technique for any historic buildings that you have in more rural sections of the island. So that's something to consider, elevating the grade there, doing some terracing to then put the building there. I've seen that done successfully along the coast, but again, in more rural areas or suburban areas. In your second question, again, could you repeat that?
Oh, it was simply, there's been some ongoing controversy, for lack of a better word, with lifting buildings or putting new foundations under historic structures, and there's
yeah, okay.
a mindset that they lose their significance.
Well, we have yet to see any kind of historic district get delisted from the National Register because of elevation. And I think this is a struggle with the National Park Service. And I mentioned, the whole tax certification projects of, does elevation still meet the Secretary of Interior standards? The Park Service is just, still, I think, thinking their way through on this. But we have to just examine that we may just be creating this entirely new story, this entirely new period of significance, an entirely new historic context for these historic districts for them to survive. So I think that's just, so to my knowledge, no, that I haven't seen properties go from contributing to non-contributing because of an elevation project. But I think the state preservation offices, and certainly at the NPS, are still sort of trying to, think through this as to what's the best approach, and just how do we deal with the reality of elevation and the impact that it has on our historic and architectural character.
Yeah, Phil, I'm going to chime in on that. I think it's really a very important point to make, because at the end of the day, if we think about, and Holly has made this point a number of times, there is a history of relocating buildings in Nantucket. It is almost part of the story, the cultural heritage, the cultural landscape of Nantucket. Look at Galveston. I mean, we have the same situation there, responding to flooding events. I can say in my communities in Maryland, they elevated buildings in the 19th century when they realized that floodwaters were rising higher and higher. So this is not the first time that communities have addressed this risk and this threat. And the Park Service tends to be very reasonable in terms of understanding that, as we always say, we need to differentiate, but we need to be compatible as we're applying the guidance, and we need to respect the fact that the environment changes. And so as the environment changes, and as the environmental setting changes, which is a component of the Secretary of Interior standards, the choices that we make need to respond to that. And it's my feeling, we'll see on a tax credit project, you're absolutely right, Phil, but I think that these guidelines, the reason they did come out with the adaptation for flooding guidelines is because they wanted to help communities figure out how to do it in a way that would be consistent. So I would be very surprised to see any delistings being recommended by local historic districts or state historic preservation offices.
Thank you.
Got 3 other hands here, Phil. I'm going to
Okay,
go
good.
to Angus. If that's okay.
Hi. Thank you so much, everybody, for putting this on today. I've stayed quiet, but I've been paying attention to it all. We really do have a mix of conditions. Lower Main Street is going to be needed to be treated most likely much differently than Brant Point. And there are so many examples that you've shown that I think work so well in like a low country vernacular where there are plantation style houses or houses that have porches that bode well for raising and having the lattice work around. We have a couple of houses on Holbert Avenue. Sand and Weed is one of my favorites that has a raised porch with lattice around it and piers. And that works really well, but that's more vegetated around it. Where it really gets tricky is where you have houses next to each other closely and one pops up. And so it's, the same thing with our wharves, North Wharf and especially where people want to save their houses, but it looks completely ridiculous for them to go up and the neighbors not to go up. So that's one of the main reasons I wanted to participate in this and hear what you had to say, because of what guidelines there really are for making this the most graceful transition as possible. And it looks to be that things like Lower Main Street really need sort of the damming experience with, because you're not going to raise one building without it looking weird. Anyway, thank you.
All right, and we have
Oh.
Sarah.
Thank you, I'm here.
Oh, Diane. Okay, then we'll go to Sarah.
Okay, you want, all right. Phil, I was curious if you thought perhaps in an area where to raise the houses to 6 feet or more, whether it could be used, whether you could combine 2 ways of the elevation, one raising it, say 3 feet, and another one out in front with a berm that would give you a 5-foot protection, so that everything didn't have to be on a street. Everything would have to be 6 feet or so in certain areas. I was wondering whether it was possible ever to combine, and whether it's ever used where a bunch of houses that are all right on the street or somewhere could use a series of protection, that each house was not individually protected, but it would be a consistent, like a consistent fence, let's say, just for description, so that it was not so higgledy-piggledy around street with one house doing it one way and another house doing it another way. I would like to ever know whether there are other ways of doing it than raising houses, which really, when particularly like in Nantucket, we have a 30-foot height, and these buildings are going up a 30-foot height, except for like the town building and the bank. But basically, it's 30 feet, and it takes the whole thing away. And I was interested because I am handicapped and can't walk. Your application of the ADA thing, particularly in the downtown district, because one of their rules is that handicap entrances should not be on the back door. We should be given the same ability to enter the front door as any other person. That's just, I think you could probably ignore it, but I know we've run into it in certain areas. So I just hope this is a new enough idea that we come up with some different, less expensive designs. We have no idea how much one of these changes elevations could cost, but they are not cheap. The other thing I was in Val's question about moving a house. I think that the Historic Society, Federal Historic Society, feels that moving a house not for danger or flooding, but to build another house does compromise the house. But to move something so it doesn't get flooded or it doesn't fall into the harbor, as we've had happen out in Nantucket, it's something that we put on the fast line to get and protect the houses. Thank you.
So I see kind of two questions here. One is about a collection of houses or a number of houses, maybe having a unified approach to flood proofing. And I think the MPS guidelines certainly encourages innovative thinking along those lines, where you can come up with some sort of dry flood proofing techniques that really will protect a series of houses. I can tell you they're looking at, in Charleston, for example, they have what they call sister houses that are all sort of joined together. And that's a real challenge for them to have property owners come up with and agree upon a strategy for flood proofing. So that is a question that a number of communities are dealing with. So, and again, the whole access, handicapped access, ADA requirements, yeah, we're going to have guidelines that look at that as well. So is there any other part of a question that I missed there? But yeah, I think the guidelines are written in a way that, are certainly encourage, thinking outside the box and coming up with alternatives when you've got a number of houses in a row. Do we have
We've
time
got two
for
more
one?
questions, Phil.
Okay, go ahead.
Sarah, I'm unmuting you.
Hi. So I have two things. First, I would say probably what I would see the biggest difficulty with our downtown historic district would be if we lift so much as 3 feet from where they are right now. That means we're adding, more steps, a landing, railings, and most of these houses sit on lot lines that don't have the ability to do that, or they're on a public way on the streetscape that it becomes a huge deal when you're trying to turn those and then access them from the side. And so I think that, probably most of the houses downtown just don't have enough room to really address that well. The other thing I would think that the town and the HDC and the, Conservation Commission probably, hopefully is looking at are more of the retention pond aspect so that when there is flooding, there are places for the water to go. And I know Lily Pond was once a pond, and hopefully that can be reclaimed again so that the water would flow from the pond to the harbor and therefore sort of alleviate a lot of the water issues that have been created from the excess, or not excess, but the development that has happened in that area, sort of, north and west of town. And so hopefully that's part of the conversation in terms of the mitigation is, yeah, we've got all this water and we've got these houses, and is there a way, rather than lifting these houses, can we move the water in such a way that it can go someplace to a retention pond and then go back into the harbor? So I guess I just want to make sure that that's part of this whole conversation as well. And it's not just about, lifting the houses.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we look at all the different alternatives in our design guidelines and with our recommendations.
Great.
And again, these are going to be your guidelines, and we'll be going back and forth on recommendations, what will work and what wouldn't work.
Thank you.
And on that note, a lot of what this is going to be is tying into the CRP discussion as well, which is that would be part of that. We got one more from Marty.
Hi, Holly. Thanks, Lisa and Phil and Holly, everyone involved in this hard work. I just want to reiterate, I think, something that Angus said. While the Preservation Institute in Nantucket over the last few years, we've been really focused on the downtown area. And I do think it's going to be important to, while there may be sort of general recommendations or guidelines that are appropriate across town, I think it's really going to be critical that we look at each individual area, like the South or the Washington Street area and the creeks that Preservation Institute in Nantucket looked at last year. The situation there is very different than Brant Point, also very different than the downtown area. So I know that's going to be a bit of a challenge, but hopefully there could be a framework put in place where there's kind of an extra layer of considerations for these maybe, adaptation areas based on their distinct historic character and urban fabric. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, you ready to continue on? Yep.
We are.
Okay, we don't have a lot left, and as we wrap this presentation up, but interior elevation, and again, this is where you're trying to adapt your commercial buildings, basically, and you want to maintain the historic character of your entrances while flood-proofing the non-elevated access spaces, and then add interior ramps or stairs that are compatible with the historic character of the entrance, while maintaining historic features such as lobby spaces or commercial storefront spaces. So the next slide shows this downtown area in Wisconsin. And so what they did was to elevate the first floor, the entire first floor got elevated. And a lot of these commercial buildings, you've got pretty serious floor to ceiling heights. So you can actually rebuild a new floor up, several feet and still retain that sort of character of your first floor. But you have here water resistant materials and stairs that go up to the next floor above. So we're seeing a number of commercial buildings institute those kind of changes in areas that are prone to flooding. And then another flood adaptation guideline is to simply vacate or adapt the first floor, where you retain historic materials, features, and finishes that are flood damage resistant, remove non-historic finishes and furnishings that absorb and trap moisture, maintain and use existing access points, entrances, stairs, and elevator shafts to gain access to upper floors, add interior stairs, elevators, or lifts within the first floor space, away from windows or storefronts at the original first floor. And a couple of years ago, I went to Cuba, and Havana has all sorts of flooding issues next to the harbor. And in many of these cases, what I found was the first floors were just vacant. Nobody lived there anymore because they flooded so often. They had so much water damage, and people just lived in the upper floors above. Venice, a number of the palaces, I think, on the Grand Canal have sort of given up on using the first floor spaces for living space, but just used as access points to the upper floors. And then finally, other adaptation, which was just discussed, move the building. Find an available site with a similar setting as possible to the original site of the building that also eliminates or reduces the flood risk. Document the historic building with photographs, a site plan, and the relationships to outbuildings and other site and landscape features noted. And hire a professional building mover to undertake the move. Ensure the move is adequately covered by insurance for all phases of the relocation project. So again, as mentioned, moving buildings is not that unusual. It was done a lot in the 19th and early 20th centuries in many of our communities. And here's an example of just picking up and moving the building to a appropriate location. And then the other example here, this was done in Cedar Rapids, where you've got the 1889 building, and then you do, here's the pre-flood circa 2006 building. And then the building is moved to a new location, wheeled over. And in this particular case, you can see that they did raise the grade here. There weren't enough historic buildings around us that this was an issue. So this was a way that they could get enough elevation with increasing the fill amount and the grade, and you can see the flood vents, and now where this building got moved. So that's sort of the series of adaptation guidelines that the NPS has in this document, and I certainly would urge you to take a look at that and review that at some point. And again, an illustrated manual is supposed to come out at some point in the future. So I see our time, and you all have been very patient, and I would propose for the exercise session that we postpone that to next Saturday. That way, I will have not only exercises for other communities, but I'll have some exercises for buildings in Nantucket as I go through my analysis this week, and I'll put together some exercises that we can do based on particular buildings that I think represent good examples throughout the island, and especially in the historic districts that we'll need to address as we go through writing and developing these design guidelines. So that meets with the group approval, given the time and the really good questions and interaction. I really appreciate it. Let's take a look at those exercises next week.
Sounds good, Phil.
Questions?
I did want to. I don't see any, but I did want to note. Oh, was that from Marty? Did you speak more? Oh, Diane, and I just did want to notate to everybody that the National Park Service guidelines are actually on the town's website in PDF. So that is available to the public. Looks like Diane.
And Holly?
Yes.
Just a note on all of this. Kim Rose, who is working with Phil and I, the three of us are going to be working together and developing a survey that we're going to be sending out after today that will ask some questions relative to what you saw presented today, to get additional feedback from obviously not just NHC and HDC members, but any members in the community. And we look to use that to help inform the design exercises and discussions when we meet again next. So that will be coming out to you to distribute and to post on the website as well.
We'll get that out to everybody who's registered as well.
And I guess I'd like to just, do we have some additional questions, comments? I think it's critical to get any other feedback or something that over the next week or so we can be looking more into on any of the adaptation strategies approached. Goodness, there's a lot of information out there. There's policy information out there as well when we get to the issue of how do we address regulations, what are best practices that relate specifically to incentives for these adaptation strategies and the like. So that may be something we can add a bit more about prior to the design exercises.
And if there's any
We do have a
buildings-
hand raised.
Yeah, if I could add, if there's any buildings that you think would be particularly important for me to take a look at, please just let Holly know about the address. And yeah, because I've got a lot of ground to cover this next week.
That you do. We have a hand raised by Tobias. There you go, Tobias.
Hello there. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, I just wanted to, chime in. Just sounds like you guys are wrapping up and say, thank you for, all the work you've done and, starting to think about this. I wanted to say, I did I have constructed or preserved a building in an 1880s farmhouse with all of these topics that have been discussed today, mainly wet proofing and, doing that in line with historic preservation. So I just want to open myself up down at the Shanty for South Beach Street Extension. If anybody wants to email me, talk to me, come down, I'm happy to show you our space. And then lastly, I kind of had a general comment, which is, when we're talking about adaptation as a community, I think it's important to really discuss about what kind of time scale we're looking at. I think there's adaptation over the next, 10 to 30 years. But ultimately, when we're looking at these sea level rise projections, and they seem to be consistently going up, that are put out by the federal government, we should make sure that the new construction and changes are in line with our climate policy. It seems disingenuous to our youth who are going to be inheriting the island in 100 years from now to have preserved a lot of historic buildings and continue to put propane and gas in those buildings. I think we should be looking at, all new construction should be net zero. That's in line with Governor Baker's executive order that came out in April. Both the state House and Senate have passed 100% renewable legislation that will be ratified by the governor in next legislative session. And so I hope we just really have a conversation about preserving buildings and also, let's really look as a society and say, we've got buildings that are 200 years old, and let's make sure our preservation techniques are looking 200-300 years into the future. And that really means dealing with climate change as a serious, in a serious way. We can look at the local election. Recently, Mr. Biden has come out to the island. He's advocated for 100% renewable by 2030 in his climate policy. We had 7,000 Nantucketers vote for Mr. Biden. And I think it's very important as a community, leaders who have a really strong understanding of history to make sure we're preserving the island in the future. And so I hope when we're talking about preservation, we're not just talking about buildings, but actually, dealing with sea level rise in a serious way. So I just want to say thank you to everyone out there. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me.
Thank you.
Chuck, do you want to, I think there is that nexus with sustainability and resiliency that we've always been talking about. And I know Nantucket has a direction forward on its sustainability. Do you want to just briefly chat about that?
Yeah, I might just echo, what Tobias said, is that preserving what we have for future generations. That's sustainability in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
And that crosses, multiple areas. And So Nantucket's beginning to take some baby steps in that direction, but, you know, I agree with Tobias, you know, we've got to look at, you know, taking what we have and making sure it's around for, you know, our children's children.
Yeah. And I'll try and actually incorporate some information. I co-presented with one of the members of the National Trust for Historic Preservation staff at a town hall a couple of weeks ago as part of the National Preservation Conference. And Jim and I were talking about the two sides of the coin in terms of climate change mitigation and the efforts we're making to address issues of climate impacts and adaptation, how we have to and are now trying to do things like this to address the short-term impacts. But really, Tobias, you're correct, it's a longer term. And looking at historic properties and the reuse of historic properties is one of the best ways to address the issue of climate impacts, climate change, because we are not adding materials to landfills. We are using the embodied energy already in buildings. We're not creating new materials when we have existing materials in place that have withstood the test of time. So in and of itself, historic preservation and the reuse and adaptive reuse of historic buildings is a sustainable practice that is more energy efficient than any of the new construction that could happen. So excellent point.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Phil. I think we had a great turnout. I think this was a good day.
Good. Thank you all and hope to see you again on the 21st. And thanks, Holly, Chuck, Vince, for being part of this. And we look forward to continuing working. And Bill, enjoy your time in Nantucket next week. I envy you.
Thank you. And thank you again for everyone who participated. Really good questions. I look forward to walking the streets and getting to know the island. Thank you.
Thank you.